priesthood to love.
Welcome to General Quarters. Today we are honored to have with us author Kevin Wells. Kevin has just published his most recent work, Priest and Beggar, The Heroic Life of Venerable Aloysius Schwartz. Kevin, welcome.
Great to be with you, Jim.
Great, but first a few points. If you like what we're talking about here, please pass this video along to friends and family. We're living in strange times, and we're fairly certain our videos are being subject to shadow banning. So please hit the subscribe button, then the like button. If you'd like to be kept up to date with all the new content, make sure you hit the bell. Lastly, before we get started, it's important to point out that we only exist because of strong Catholics like you who support us. So if you're so inclined and you can afford it, please donate to www.lepantoin.org/donate. Anyway, Kevin, wow, listen, great to have you. I read your book, Priest and Beggar. Hang on one second. The Heroic Life of Venerable Aloysius Schwartz, correct?
That's it.
Great. And in the show notes, we're going to put information as to how you get the book. But first, before we get started, Kevin, do me a favor. Briefly tell us about your background, where you grew up, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And thanks for reading the book. I think it's an important book for Catholics to read in this day and age. As far as my background, large Irish Catholic family, grew up in Maryland, the DC suburbs. It was a great upbringing. I had a mom and dad who were intentionally Catholic, prayed the rosary an awful lot. We all went to Catholic schools. I went to 16 years of Catholic schooling, for whatever that's worth. I somehow survived it. I have a brother who's a priest. I had an uncle who was a priest. I think my dad, my mom, God bless her soul, it passed away, I guess, 7 years ago. But my dad, I think, has 29, 30 grandchildren, and all his kids and grandkids are practicing Catholics. Thank God. For some reason, it's stuck. People have often asked my dad over the years, why do you think it's stuck with your kids and grandkids, et cetera? And his answer is pretty simple. And I guess I buy it. He said, we were a family who prayed the rosary. So we were all jocks, my brothers and I had 5 brothers. We all played baseball and other sports. And, I was really lucky. I went to DeMatha Catholic High School in DC. It was a great high school. And, not too much drama to report, just kind of, a happy Catholic family. We had our struggles like everyone else, but we kind of overcame them because our parents taught us right from wrong.
Wow. First of all, this is not about me, it's you, but I totally identified with everything you said. Large Irish Catholic family, rosary central to the family. We'll talk about that on the outside, but that very, very powerful. So after that, you began your career as a sports writer, I believe, right? And then transitioned to, tell me about that.
Well, Jim, I always like to write. And as I mentioned, I was a jock and I said, why not? Why don't I just combine the two? I love baseball. Baseball is kind of this icon of my soul. Since professional sports sort of went woke the past several years, I don't watch a lot of sports anymore, but I love baseball. It's just something about the game that, so it was always
iconically American. Quite honestly, I know what you're saying about that. I used to work at Yankee Stadium, and there's something about sitting in a ballpark with the beer on a hot summer day. It's just, go ahead. It really is. It's wonderful. Go ahead.
Yeah. You could talk to the guy next to you for 9 innings and discuss your entire life as a baseball game unfolds before you. So the goal was always to become a Major League Baseball writer. So after college, I ended up in Florida. I moved down from Maryland to Florida because I wanted to pursue that goal. And providentially, I guess, I don't know if it's providential, but Major League Baseball awarded a brand new franchise in Arizona and Tampa Bay, of all places. And I told my executive sports editor, I said, hey, look, 2 years from now, when they play the first game, I want to be your first beat reporter for the Tampa Bay Rays. And I said, I'm going to do whatever I can, have me cover high school girls softball, have me cover horse racing, have me cover taekwondo. I don't care. Just give it to me, and I'm going to prove to you that I can. So I actually, on opening day, I was the Tampa Tribune's first Devil Rays beat writer. Back then they were called the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. So yeah, so I sort of was living out in Murphy's Law there for a while, and I was covering baseball and other sports. So it was good. This was back in the I guess it was back in 1998 when that job started.
Wow, that's great. And by the way, you must hear this a lot, but that's kind of everyone's like dream job in a way. Covering sports like that. If you're going to be in media, I mean, every guy in the world wants to do that. So congratulations. So you just it sounds like you had other abilities like focusing and tenacity and ambition. So very cool.
Thanks.
Next thing. So, and this is, if I may, this is where it gets to me really kind of fascinating. So you kind of wanted to transition a little bit, and I'm going to presume that you felt you had something to say. You while you're doing your sports writing, I think you got into sort of inspirational Catholic fact-based writing. If you could tell me about this, because this is really powerful. We're going to talk about a family. If you could talk about a certain relative of yours, what happened, and please go ahead.
Well, Jim, it was almost like a guillotine that cut the sports writing in half, and it happened like this. My wife and I met my wife in Florida. She's Floridian. We wanted to have this big Irish family of 10 kids, just like the family I'm from. And we found out right after marrying, or soon after marrying, that we could have no kids. God didn't bless us that way. And what happened was, my wife and I very quickly fell into Hatfield and McCoy, where I've been taught that the Catholic Church taught that in vitro fertilization was impermissible. And my wife, God bless her, she wasn't at that time catechized in the same way that I was, and she wanted to do in vitro.
This goes back to your original point, which you had mentioned, and it just sort of was a very slight one. You went through 16 years of Catholic school. I went through 12 years. There was no catechesis.
Yeah.
There was not. Your average Catholic, if you were to say that today, would look at you like, what are you talking about? Right? So please continue.
So we're right, Jim. Somehow we lucked out there. And really, I guess it's mom and dad. So finally, really, what a way to start your honeymoon. You're fighting every day with your new wife. I mean, this is supposed to be the greatest time. So finally I said, hey, Krista, we got to figure this thing out. She wanted to fight for the child she knew could grow in her womb. And I said, well, look, we got to adopt. So finally I said, will you come with me back to Maryland? We got to figure this thing out. And she said, you know what? It's time to go. So we took the loneliest I-95 northbound trip ever taken.
Oh, yeah.
And we stuck the infertility in the back of the U-Haul as well. And we got to Maryland, and it didn't get any better, obviously, because it wasn't resolved. So finally I did the inevitable. I did what I did not want to do. I approached my uncle, Monsignor Wells, and I said, hey man, Tommy, he was my dad's brother. He was a giant of a priest in DC. And I said, hey man, she cries herself to sleep every night, but she doesn't want me to touch her because I'm on the wrong side. What do I do? And he said, hey, come on over. I know you've been hiding her from me because it'll be 2 against 1. And I know you want to pick a fight, but get over here and bring her. And I said, she's not going to come. He said, bring Krista. So I asked Krista to come, and it was June 6th, 2000. And we went out to his rectory in Germantown, Maryland, and he broke open an omnibus on redemptive suffering and God's mysterious plans, and how, God was inviting us through this infertility to carry the cross, the full weight of the cross. And he really just he just broke into us. We heard words we had never considered. And by the end of the night, Krista, tears just coming down all night. I didn't know whether she was crying because she was angry, upset, she was believing it. But anyway, Jim, as you may know, 2 nights later, my uncle was murdered, stabbed to death in that rectory. This happened 2 days before he was killed. So my wife and I, on the very night we had our lives changed, and Krista was broken into. Tommy left us when a homeless tree trimmer, drug fueled, broke into his rectory and stabbed him to death.
Uh, that incredibly powerful. And talk about redemptive suffering. I know that was I know that was a huge moment in your life. I know you'd written very eloquently on how close you were to your Uncle Tommy, and I think it's fair to say, Kevin, that was a seminal moment in your life. You changed at that time, and I believe that. Can you talk about that a little bit from the event of that, and the not certainly not ancillary part about the tremendous suffering you and your wife were going through. Your Uncle Tommy all of a sudden speaks to you, really touches both your hearts, and you're moving forward. Then all of a sudden he's brutally murdered. What happened then, if I may ask?
Well, more and more. So Krista's life was changed that night. She realized that in vitro was really against God's natural law. It was an unnatural way of creating life. So we finally joined the team. The Hatfield McCoys joined together and married,
Sure.
and we began to adopt. And life after the tragedy went away took on a more leisurely and sort of a pleasant, normal marriage. It was wonderful, But as time went on, I began to see, Tommy broke in and saved our lives and had saved countless people in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area over and over and over again.
Yes, he was highly thought of. I mean, almost like iconic in a way.
Yeah, Jim, you line up 100 priests in a row back then, and you say, who's the most powerful priest? Who loves the priesthood? Who loves the Eucharist? Who's the most Marian? 95 out of those 100 would say Monsignor Thomas Wells. He was a paragon in the DC area. So I began to see more and more that from behind the ambo at masses, not only wasn't it sort of a bridge to get me to heaven, what priests should be saying, but it was a contraception of the prophetic voice. It was a damming up of things, and it rather than it sort of going away, it seemed more and more there was reluctance to take on the sanctity that we as laity need to live out every day. And so that sort of led me into Catholic writing. I began to write stories for LifeSite News, for Crisis Magazine, different periodicals. And finally I said, you know what? It's good to write articles, but it lives in me to write a book. And in 2019, I had written The Priests We Need to Save the Church, and it really got out there pretty good. And really, the book was just one thing. It was a priest, the centerpiece of a priest vocation. The centerpiece of a priest vocation should be an identification with the crucified Christ, in the way he offered himself as a Holocaust, in the way he prayed, in the way he was devoted to Mary, in his ascetical life, in his prophetic voice, in the way he was a father, the way he was available, et cetera, et cetera. So this sort of struck a chord, I guess. And so I had written a book prior. So I guess what we're leading up to here, Jim, is when the book came out, in the aftermath, a married couple came up to me and they said, we know who the priest we need to save the church is, and his name is Venerable Aloysius Schwartz. He's the skin on the bones of the priest we need to save the church. So I began to study his life, and I said, my goodness, I've read the lives of the paragons, John Vianney, Bosco, Neri, Damien the Leper, John Newman, DePaul. But what I read about this guy Schwartz, this American superhero, I had not read before. And I said, yeah, I want to write his biography.
Well, I must say, I never heard of him either. And we spent some time together in Maryland, you and I, with a bunch of other people. And I got to know you a little bit. And I heard about your book. And so there was a copy there, and I picked it up and just read the cover. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. So the reason it was amazing to me is that you don't. Well, first of all, your observation that this is what we need, I believe, is dead on right. This guy was a priest, very much like your Uncle Tommy. And not only was he a priest, he really embraced the cross. That was his whole idea. I mean, it seemed like he almost trained for it. Can you go in a little bit for the folks at home here? Because I'm telling you guys, you really, you would be so blessed to buy this book and read it. It is a fascinating account of one man's sole purpose in life to serve Jesus Christ through his mother and embrace the cross. And I am not understanding. It's just fascinating from the moment he grew up, where he grew up during the Depression. Anyway, could you start about that and tell the folks at home you do it a much better way, obviously, than I would.
Well, Jim, thank you. No, you spoke very well, very eloquently. He was an astonishing individual, and I contend that every American Catholic, whether you're Orthodox or more left of center, there's no escaping it with Father Al. There's no
No,
escaping it
no.
because he was astonishing in saying, I want to live out a life as Jesus, the starved man from the cross, the poor man of Nazareth, where if I'm not offering myself fully, almost like a tipped over chalice of our Lord's most precious blood that spills out and saves the humiliated, the poor, the rejected, the abandoned. If I don't live the way Christ lived, then I'm not a priest. I'm like a clown show. I'm a masquerading priest. And from the earliest age, at the age of 8 or 9, he had read this comic book in the Depression called The Boy Commandos. And the Commandos were these four orphans.
Right.
Yeah, there were 4 orphans that would go into Hitlerville and Naziville, and they'd want to take on the bad guys because no one else would. Well, Father Al used to fall asleep at night reading this comic book, The Boy Commandos. And at that early age, in that house on the wrong side of the tracks in Washington, D.C., he said, I wonder if a priest can save this way, do the hard things, the gritty things, the thing no one wants to do. And Jim, we were talking about baseball earlier. I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player, but as things go on, you realize by the time you're 17, 18 years old that you don't have the talent. So things just kind of dim. With Father Al, at the age of 8 or 9, he wanted to be a sacrificial, heroic, almost comic book hero priest. And rather than dimming, they rose. So he was a guy, Al, from the earliest age that said, I want to be a saint, and I know I cannot be a saint unless I have the identification of Christ crucified on the cross. And what he did, I believe, has never been done before in the history of the church.
Well said. I as I said, I read the book, and it was fascinating. The Kid Commandos, or what were they with those guys?
Commandos.
Yeah, and he really loved those comic books, and actually that kind of thing in his faith saved him from some pretty tough guys in the neighborhood. He grew up in a bad part of town. This is not a guy who sat around, in a bucolic setting, looking up to the heavens, praying the rosary. He had to fight on a day-to-day basis, and his family was starving, and his father was in the hospital, I think, for a year, or something like that, if I remember correctly. So yeah, the book grabbed me immediately, and you're just going, oh gosh. Now, if you could maybe continue on Father Al's life, but before that, let's give it a little context, right? Korea, after the war, arguably was one of the worst places on earth, and we call it the Forgotten War, right? That's the name for it. And there was a situation there where just the children, due to the kindness of Americans, they placed was 200,000, right? Because now, why were they 200? It was much more than that. I couldn't find an accurate number because first of all, people were starving. That's number one. Number two is if a serviceman had impregnated a woman, that child was persona non grata. There was a name for it, which I forget, but quite literally, what was often the case, and there was a documentary on it done called Dropbox, right, which is where these women could drop the children. They would literally leave them in the street. One particular moving story was a 5-year-old boy left home. He saw his mom buttoned up his coat, looked at him and said, okay, now stay here. Last year was saw her again. And so tell a little more of Father Al, and he actually ran to this hell on earth.
Yeah, so Father Al wanted to experience the privations of Christ. So he did raise his hand in 57, and he asked his rector, I want to go to the worst place. And at that time, it was post-war Korea. So he got off a train on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and he got out and saw a dystopian novel. It was just ruination. There's lepers in the street rubbing their limbs against people to steal their money. There was the tubercular set up in camps on mountainsides to die where no one wanted to touch them. Unwed mothers underneath bridges, and children. Jim, as you identified, these children were just left over like shrapnel from the war, like leftover landmines, and just left to die because people were devastated from the war. Where over 1 million died, and they didn't have time for these kids. And Father Al said, Mary, he gave his entire priesthood to the Virgin of the Poor, Mary, and he said, Mary, you brought me home. And he kind of smelled this. Busan, Korea was just a train wreck of an area in Korea, and he smelled the human waste and the rot and the trash and the debris, and he said, this is the incense of Golgotha. This is the incense of my home. Thank you, Mary. And one by one, he kind of acted like Atlas, and he started to put these children and the lepers and the tubercular and the unwed mothers on his back. And within 10, 15 years, all of South Korea is being re-engineered with Catholic hospitals, elementary schools in the dumps, in the slums, hospices, tuberculariums, boys' towns, girls' towns, orphanages, because of one man, Aloysius Schwartz, who wanted to be a superhero. He had changed Southern Korea.
Wow. Yeah. And again, back to the book. And just as a side note, one of the things I couldn't help but think when I was reading through the book, this is made for a movie. I quite honestly, I mean, I think that one of the biggest criticisms I seem to see is, I have a daughter, she's 22. And, sometimes, I try to find movies, we can watch together, really enjoy it. And it's very, very difficult. And to find a movie about the triumph of the human spirit in conjunction with the narrative of the cross is virtually impossible. Right? Even if it's done on an ideological level where there's even an inference to the cross, forget it. It just seems everything's so dark. And I read your book, and I remember thinking to myself, this is really, really powerful, and would be such a much needed message to a world that's so disordered. But that's for another time. Just also as a side note, and we talked about this earlier. My father was an infantry officer in Korea, and in the early 50s, and he years later, when I was a kid in the 70s, he spoke to all of us about the plight of these children. He saw it when he was in combat over there. He was in pretty heavy combat. Literally, he even said I was outdoors for 1 year, and he would consistently run across these kids. And when they would go to the major population centers, on his way out, they were everywhere, and it really stuck with him. And in the 70s. He made us give a portion of our allowance, and he put in the rest, and we kind of adopted one as a family. And that's why I hadn't thought about that for a while till I saw your book, and it really brought that home. So thank you for that. It really did it perfectly. So now maybe if you could take it a little further, because Father Al, as they affectionately called him, by the way, is his name Aloysius? Is that how it's pronounced? Okay, yeah. Father Al, he actually ran into Mother Teresa a couple of times. People in his own quiet way knew he was, but he set up an infrastructure, right, that was replicated throughout the world. Is that fair? Tell a little bit about that.
Yeah, Jim. Father Al was Mother Teresa on the front end. So when Mother Teresa would grab the dying beggar and let him die with dignity with her many sisters, Father Al said, "I'll make sure that man is never there." So he would grab the dying 8-year-old girl, boy, whoever, and say, "I will build you a humble kingdom of resurrection." And he built these boys' towns and girls' towns where the kids were catechized, they were taught, they were played with, sports, music, everything that a poor kid without a mother and a father could have. Father Al threw it at them with the order that he founded, the Sisters of Mary. And what they did was one thing more than anything else, other than sacramentalizing these kids, with the sacraments, they formed the Catholic soul. What Catholic schools worldwide are not doing today, many of them, Father Al said, "No, I will form your soul to be Catholic." So these kids, even on this very day, Jim, there's over 20,000 children today in 7 different countries that are in these schools, and I believe, and I contend, and I'll contend this until the cows come home, they are today's greatest Catholic missionaries, because when they leave these boys' towns and girls' towns after 5 years, They go into universities, they go into workplaces, they go back into their old villages, and they say, I am Lazarus raised from the tomb. These sisters taught me what it is to live again, and I will show you. Look at my eyes. These are the eyes of someone that came out of a tomb. I was dead, I'm alive, and I do not care what you say about this form of marriage or gender. I do not care what you say about Catholic faith being too rigid. I know what the Catholic faith is because they told me about Father Al. The sisters showed it to me. I prayed the rosary every night at 7 p.m. and I'm alive again. And let me teach you the faith. These kids, I contend, Jim, not bishops, not priests, I don't know whom. I believe these kids, and every year there's between 5,000 and 6,000 of them that graduate, are going into the world, all over the world, and catechizing the battered part of our Catholic Church as authentically built Catholics whose soul has been formed by these sisters.
You speak from experience because I read one of your articles, I believe it was on LifeSite News, and you went down and visited these people and spent some time with them in Mexico. And tell me about that, because I was really, look, Kevin, I'm not trying to be effusive. It was a very powerful argument. And I believe part of it opened up in your book. I believe part of that, the description of that. Can you please talk about that? And then I'd like to talk about, if you could, why? Why is this? Though you're 100% right. These are the next, shall we say, Catholic evangelists. These are the guys who are going to spread the faith, because they've lived it authentically, they've experienced it, and they have a Marian devotion, which isn't a small point, much like you mentioned earlier with your family, because of Father Al. So it's a two-part question. The first is, tell us about the time you spent time with these guys. And secondly, I'd like to talk about the hierarchy a little bit. Go.
Okay, very good. Two divergent thoughts there. So the first one is when you go through the gates of, I'll say, where I was in Chalco and Guadalajara. Chalco is girls' town where 3,300 girls reside. Guadalajara, there's 2,600 boys. It's heaven when it's weird to say it's what heaven feels like, but when you
Sure.
when you reside in these places, it is heaven, because when you think of heaven, what it might be, you think of order, you think of harmony, and you think of radiance, a light. And when you go into these communities, these kids, and this is not silly pie in the sky stuff where kids have Branch Davidian smiles on. This is true. I've been resurrected. The sisters lifted the lid of my tomb. They grabbed me from these neighborhoods where human traffickers lived, where MS-13 lived, where murderers lived, and they took me back down these mountains, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Veracruz, where monsters live. They brought me into these places of protection and resurrection. I know life now. I'm protected, and I'm learning about the fullness of how God the Father loves me. I never knew it before. These sisters put the skin on the bones of God. God was always invisible in their poverty or their distress. The sisters slowly build God into where the kids can see them. So it's like heaven. I'll tell you this. So I wanted to go down there in the research for my book on Father Al. I needed to talk to the sisters that were there with Father Al at the end of his life as he was dying from Lou Gehrig's disease. So they were down in Chalco, and I began to meet with them. And I remember on the first night I was there, I met Sister Margie. She's kind of the Mother Superior. And she said, Kevin, I know why you're here. And if you really want to begin to know Father Al, start with the children. Show up at 9:00 tomorrow morning. And I did. And 12 girls were waiting for me. They had their white shirts on, their blue skirts, and they were smiling. And then one by one, they began to tell their story, and I saw them as 12 broken apostles. And the first girl who came up, her name was Zyra, and she told me how she was chased more than an hour up a mountain by a human trafficker. And when she would go home at night, she would go to a home whose grandfather was always drunk every night. So not only was she coming home from school avoiding human traffickers that would sell her into slavery, but she went to a grandfather who was drunk, no mom and dad. So next girl, Antonina said, I'm an orphan. I saw my father shot dead in the street, and I believe my mother was burned to death. So one by one, these girls tell me their stories, but these broken apostles, their souls have been salvaged and saved. I go back to what I said earlier, Jim, and I I don't know how to reinforce this or be any more urgent with what I'm saying. These kids, these bullied, once broken kids, leave whole because the sisters and their chaplain down there, Father Dan Leary, they're like, they have like a scalpel, and they dig and they dig and they dig at the wound, and they say, you can't leave this place without the wound healed. So when they finally get to the wound and say, will you walk and will you be free? And the kid finally gets it and like, yeah, you know what? I got to drop this memory. I got to drop this when I was raped as an 11-year-old, when I was abused by my touchy-feely uncle at the page. So they leave as 18-year-olds and they're free to be fully Catholic and to get into the world fearless. They are like Father Al and like the sisters, they're fearless. So they don't care about what the culture says. They don't care about what's left and what's right. They just know what the truth of the gospel is. And since their soul has been Catholically formed, it can't be moved. They're bulldozers for the faith.
Wow. I got to say this too. As I was researching some of your writings for this show, and I was looking around, there is a picture of you in the midst of these girls where you're in the front row. And I'm going to put it, with your permission, I'm going to put in the show notes. It's moving. Everyone, and one of the things I noticed was I was looking at it. You have that thing where you pop it up on your TV screen, and I popped it up on my TV screen. It was larger. Every one of them is smiling. Like every one of those kids is smiling, and it looks like you're having a blast. And but I couldn't do a better job than what you just explained. I mean, that's really powerful stuff. I mean, and it leads to another point. The purpose of our church and Jesus Christ on the cross is not social justice. This is not the purpose of why Christ came here. That is a relevant and natural outcome of one's trying to embrace the cross. That's where good deeds, charity, and social justice comes from. It's not the primary thing. One's human, one is spiritual. You know what I mean? There's a huge difference. And you mentioned it earlier, and I think we've lost our way. These nuns that you talk about, these Father Owls, this is not the centrality of their actions. The centrality of their actions is love of Jesus Christ through his mother. This is a natural outcome of that love. And there is a huge distinction. I think we've lost our way on it. Could you speak to that a little bit, maybe possibly with the hierarchy?
Yeah, I think it's, this is just me since you asked the question.
Yeah, you want to same with me, right?
Yeah, we reside in a mostly fatherless church, and I think it's why are we fatherless? Well, because I think the greatest problem is really comfort. Too many bishops and priests have chosen the path of comfort. So where a priest's identity has always been attached to offering their lives as a holocaust, as a sacrifice to save souls. I mean, that's their identity.
Yes.
I think the priesthood or bishops, they've re-engineered their identity to fit more with the world, whereas a priest always had known for 2,000 years that everything he did was based around two things. One, obviously they administer the sacraments because they're the only ones that can. Number two, save souls. That's no longer seems to be the case. And I believe it's because they've made a choice.
Yes.
Choice and comfort, the two C words. Their choice is, do I want to live out my life as Christ did? Again, the starved man from the cross who spilled his blood to give all. Do I want to be that person in persona Christi as a priest, or do I choose something more comfortable? I contend because bishops and priests all over the world, not all of them, because Jim, you and I both know holy priests,
absolutely,
but far too many have chosen the path of what seems to be a bachelorhood priesthood. Too many clergy have chosen something that does not look like John Vianney or Bosco, someone willing to take on the 18-hour days, the 8 hours in the confessional box, the late nights, the early mornings, praying the divine office with intentionality and reverence, all of it. You can choose that, or you can go and say, you know what? I can shut off the cell phone at 7:00 at night. I can lock the rectory at 7:00 at night. I can sort of make work my prayer. That'll be my prayer now. Well, that's unacceptable. That's a big fat no. A priest does not do that. You know, just like me I'm a father. I'm a father. If my daughter comes home at 2 a.m. and her curfew's 11 and I don't handle it and I don't wait up for it, then she's fatherless. If I allow my daughter to go to a prom wearing something promiscuous and I just let it go, then she's fatherless. If I don't handle my son who's off the tracks, my teenage son off the tracks with something, and I don't pull out my heart and show him to him and say, hey, son, I love you. Let's figure this thing out. Then my son is fatherless. I believe our church today is bleeding out and losing generations of Catholic families because they have been orphaned. Father Al, it's funny we're saying this, or if I'm saying this, Father Al was a father of orphans. 170,000 kids have graduated these boys' towns and girls' towns because he worked every day of his life, 16, 17, 18-hour days, no days off. Yes. Mary, I will take no days off because I want to be Jesus, the starved man on the cross who gave everything. I think that's why we're suffering today, is because of comfort.
You know, Kevin, I'm not just saying this, that I agree with everything that you just said. And I would add one thing. I've noticed too, and you really hit these points. When I listen to these guys speak, it's almost as if I'm listening to corporate CEOs. And, you know what I mean? And you look at their sort of tacit agreement with the world, and it seems to me social justice, if you want to call it that, in causes. For example, immigration, wonderful thing, right? Got to help these folks, right? Anyone who's suffering, we want to help. Yet there's a structural alignment now with so many underlying evil, things, frankly, of things like immigration, right there to help and collect that sort of government check to help in that department. It seems to me that they seem to be, generally speaking, they've lost their way to what you just said, as opposed to a life of sacrifice, embracing the cross and the sacraments, and understanding at a very fundamental level what a priest is, or even more so, understanding on a fundamental level, what is the church for? The church is for the salvation of souls. The church, again, I'll beat this point to death. I don't care if I said it 3 times during this broadcast. Yes, helping the poor in charity comes out of that. It is not the primary purpose. And I think that loss of focus has opened up quite literally a Pandora's box of personal behavioral problems, of a sort of cliquish recruiting process of people who were like-minded, who were more interested in social causes than they are about embracing the cross. And I think we've seen it incrementally, very slowly and diabolically. And I think when you look at guys like your Uncle Tommy, who, by the way, I knew priests in that area when I was checking this out. They still know of him. He's very well known, not just because of what had happened to him. I mean, he really was iconic. When I look at guys like your Uncle Tommy, when I look at Father Al, that's what brings us home, and that's why I don't apologize for this. Guys, buy this book. You really need to read it. I think that you'll be reminded of what a priest is and what a priest is supposed to be. And I think that with that, Mr. Wells, what's your projects, man? Anything you're working on now?
So Jim, so I was at Ignatius Press last month, I guess, in San Francisco, and so 2 or 3 books were laid out that I want to write. One I have in mind right now, nothing I want to share right now, but I'm doing an awful lot of, like I was just at the Legatus Summit out west. So I'm doing a lot of speaking about Father Al. Tonight I'm talking about Father Al. I'll say this, Jim, I want to get the story about Father Al out there now. I mean, this guy was around when Michael Jordan was halfway through his career. He died in 92. This guy's not from 1550. This guy was around now. He's an American. He was a cowboy, and he did things that I believe are not being done any longer. So we judge by the fruit, right?
Yeah.
So Father Al said, I must be the seed who dies. And he produced an incomprehensible harvest of kids who were saved, lepers, tubercular, unwed mothers. It wasn't just the kids saved throughout the world because he died. What happens today in chanceries, in rectories, in the Vatican? It's this choice. Am I a social justice priest? Am I one who can talk about immigration only? Am I one who talks about, well, we need to be made it? Am I one, Jim, as you mentioned, that is out for the salvation of your soul? Where are we today? I contend that we do not have nearly as many Father Owls as we need to. Father Owl is on the path to canonization. He's venerable, and he will be an American saint very soon. The Holy Spirit determines this thing, but he'll be a saint because he was one that wanted to be Jesus on the cross, suffocating, giving all. Because he knew, Jim, as you just said, it was all about the salvation of souls and building the kingdom of God.
Absolutely, 100%. And as a side note, worth noting, as you read about Father Al, you also cannot help but notice this is not a man without options. This man was an excellent student. I believe he studied at the Louvain in Belgium, and right, you wrote about that. But is that where Fulton Sheen went? If I'm not mistaken,
yeah,
I think Fulton Sheen went. And I remember piecing this together. You don't just get into the Louvain. You know what I mean? This is like, and by the way, oh, this is great. I'm glad I mentioned this. He shows up to the Louvain, and they go, oh, yeah, and by the way, the classes are in Latin and French. Okay, Father Al, according to your book, he only knows Latin from Mass. He can't speak, no Latin, and he can't speak French. I tried to speak French. I was in Paris a long time. I can't speak French. Okay, he nailed this down in 3 months. He just threw himself. He had an incredible work ethic, an incredible intellectual talent. So let's just say it wasn't like Father Al became Father Al because, well, it was either that or being a cop. No. I mean, you really nailed that down. And when you went through his life, and you're kind of picking this up, and everywhere he went, he threw himself into it. I mean, could you imagine learning Latin and French in 3 months?
Jim, let's also not forget. So he was brilliant, Jim.
Yeah.
Right, he was very smart.
Yeah.
But let's also remember, with no business acumen, none,
right,
he had raised over $250 million for the poor.
Right.
So he was a guy who did things that don't make sense. And I'll say this, I believe, because he consecrated his life to Mary in 1957 at her apparition site in Bonnot, Belgium. And he said, Mary, I am now your slave.
Yes.
You carry the whip hand. I will give you all, and I will take no days off. Mary knew that she had someone who was cooperating with him as he would stretch out his life to live like her son. So she said, I will protect you. And mafia kingpins went after Father Al. American bishops went after Father Al. His own bishop tried to get him thrown out of the country. His own seminary rector tried to get him thrown out. But one by one,
you're knocked down.
Nobody could get Father Al because Mary said, you are my boy, and I am sending you out. And he won every single time.
Yeah, well said. By the way, that was Our Lady of the Poor, I believe, in Belgium, right?
Yeah,
really great book, Kevin. All of these things are in there, and you can't help but notice what you just said. One by one, no one could touch Father Al, and he did it with a smile. He apparently he had a remarkable wit and very affable, and everyone loved him. Like great stories from his diary, right? Because he had some time off, so he decides to just go to France, and a bunch of people picked him up, loved him. Put him in a hotel room, gave him money to eat. I mean, stuff like that. And some tough days too. He learned how to paint, just to make a living. But anyway, just a great book, guys. Uplifting and exactly the right Catholic messaging. Kevin, thank you so much for taking time with us. And it looks like we're about out of time. So before we go, it's important to point out we only exist because of strong Catholics like you support us. So if you can, and you're so inclined, you can afford it. lepantoin.org/donate. That's lepantoin.org/donate. There's a second way also, if you'd like, for any sort of gift for anyone you love. We have this beautiful Lepanto Sacred Heart Cross. Michael Hitchborn designed it. He credits very much like Father Al, Our Lady. And please visit LepantoCatholicGifts.com, LepantoCatholicGifts.com. It's beautiful. It's silver. It's not hollow. And frankly, it's beautiful. But I'll tell you, I'm going to put a couple of articles in the show notes. I'm going to put a link to how to get your book. Kevin, I really want to thank you for taking the time. real honor to have you. And I mean, you did a wonderful job explaining this. I really hope to see this on a movie screen one day, because it should be. I know that's not, you didn't mention that, but I do. I think that thing should be on the big screen. So who knows? Let's pray for that.
Well, thank you, Jim. It was a true honor to be with you. Lepanto Institute is one of the truly good and efficacious organizations in the world today. So tell Michael hi, and thank you for your work, Jim. And thanks for inviting me in.
You bet, Kevin. I'll tell Michael Hitchborn you said hi. This is Jim Maughan from the Lepanto Institute General Quarters saying goodbye, and Viva Cristo Rey. See you later, Kevin.
See you, Jim.